Owatlo. My name is David Cobb. I serve as the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. My pronouns are he, him, and it is my honor to welcome you back to the Decolonizing Economics Summit, from Earth Day to May Day. This session is titled Decolonizing Finance, and from my way of thinking, this is one of the most provocative, the most challenging, and perhaps the most hopeful of the sessions that we were doing, because I really believe that if we can figure out how to finance the transition, we can get our way back to the balance that we're supposed to be living in. I have the great honor of knowing each one of our panelists on a personal basis as well as a professional basis, and I am very much looking forward to this conversation. Our first panelist is Stephanie McHenry. Stephanie serves as the Chief Executive Officer at the Democracy Collaborative, a 20-year-old think and do tank that works to turn community wealth building into visions and models that demonstrate new principles of a democratic economy that operate within planetary boundaries, while also helping to lay the pathways for systemic transformation. Prior to her role at the Democracy Collaborative, Steph was Vice President for Policy Advocacy and Strategic Initiatives for Cleveland Neighborhood Progress. She has also served as Chief Financial Officer for at Cleveland State University. She's been a banker. She is a leader in this movement and a personal friend. With that, I welcome Steph McHenry.
Well, thanks so much, Dave, and thanks for allowing me to be a part of all of this. I am going to share a brief PowerPoint just to get through really three big ideas, and let me start doing that now. And my cat loves me very much right now. So this whole notion of decolonizing finance for me is really a personal journey. I consider myself, as you can see in the title here, to be a former banking resistor. What I mean by that is I was doing banking unlike many other people do banking. I served at Shore Bank, as David mentioned, and not to make light of all the violence that's going on in the world, but I do feel somewhat battle scarred through that process of running a licensed commercial bank and trying to do it in a way that has community benefits. So I'm going to just share with you kind of three big ideas that talk about my experience with that and that I think are relevant to what we need to think about going forward in terms of financing the change we want to see. And here are the three big points. One, resist pressure to assimilate. Two, think really local. And three, trust differently. And this is from the perspective of someone who was responsible of getting dollars into underinvested, marginalized communities in a way that started to turn those communities around. I had the opportunity to do that in Chicago for a little bit, then down in Arkansas, and most of my time here in Cleveland. So let me go through sort of those three big points. And the one other thing I'll say on the outset is, Shore Bank, it was a for-profit bank. It was not a nonprofit, and it existed for 30-something years. It ultimately failed and then reopened as Urban Partnership Bank the next week. That's a story we can talk about at some point, but it had to do with capital and had to do with markets. But I can tell you that running a nonprofit is harder in a lot of ways than running a for-profit. So, there's a lot of jargon that people use to try to make you think otherwise, but the stuff we're doing here is really difficult. And it requires business sense plus. So let's go down these points. First of all, resist pressure to assimilate. What do I mean by that? What I mean is to assimilate to the rules and what people consider to be best practices for traditional lending and investing, right? So these industries have been around for a lot of years, and people make rules to to be able to get through them and establish certain best practices. But there are a few things we need to understand about that. First of all, that most of the rules are devised to reduce risk, right? So risk in lending, so to increase the chance that you'll get paid back whatever dollars you put out, and to reduce the risk in investing, meaning that you'll reap a profit on whatever you invest in whatever markets. However, that risk is being defined by people with very conservative eyes, right? Especially in the banking world, because you have deposits to worry about. So, so the people that get to define risk in those rulemaking places are doing it from a very conservative perspective. So if you're trying to do something different, if you're trying to make different kinds of decisions in terms of how you invest in, how and whether you invest in certain communities, chances are your risk profile is not going to necessarily match that of those rules. I like to give the example, my last safety and soundness exam at ShoreBank when I was president of the bank. It was a fairly small branch, so I think we had about 10 people on the team. And when the examiners came in to look at our work, there were more of them than there were us. So I had 12 examiners in my conference room for 2 weeks, over probably $100 billion in assets. Meanwhile, one of the largest, oldest banks in the city was in the process of failing and did in fact fail that same year. So you're going to get undue scrutiny because the way we look at things is different than the rules. And the other thing to understand about these rules and sort of the best practices, the shortcuts are they're really shortcuts to help you get through something faster. When you're dealing in an extractive format and you are trying to maximize profits, speed and volume become very important. So certain rules, certain logarithms are put in place to let you be able to decide quickly. But sometimes that does not allow you to really see what's before you, to really see the opportunity before you if it doesn't, in fact, fit the neat mold that those rules would lay out. And very seldom do those rules, although things got better and are somewhat getting better, but they don't often adequately consider the size of the opportunity for a good outcome, over and beyond with that particular borrower, but for the entire neighborhood or entire community. And they don't often show you ways to mitigate what that perceived risk is. So point number one, resist the pressure to assimilate and to follow and to necessarily see things in the way that everyone else sees them. The next big point is, in my opinion, think hyper local, meaning really understand the communities where you are doing business, whether you're lending or investing. Because I think that does two things. It helps you understand that risk better because you know not just what's going on with that borrower, but you really can get a feel for what's going on in that entire community versus trying to deal with a national market where, sometimes it's anybody's guess what goes on. So it's easier to understand local market dynamics. You might even have some stake in those dynamics. For example, we used to like to lend a lot in a single neighborhood. Well, some people might say, well, that's risky because you got all your risk with the dynamics of that neighborhood. But on the other hand, you know that neighborhood is getting invested in because you're investing in it. And you're starting to see, some of the synergies happen among the various projects that you're investing in. The other reason to do that, point B is if you really think hyper local and you really want to finance local, that you're guaranteed to get local benefit. You don't have to wait for it to trickle down or whatever the current metaphor is for promising something that you never get, right? People say, oh, if you just, if you invest in this, and I'm probably gonna get in trouble for this, if you invest in this stadium, somehow all those bazillions of dollars are gonna somehow end up back in your community. Well, maybe not. But if you invest in someone that's doing business right there, or at least bringing dollars into that neighborhood, like with the commercial laundry that we were involved with, we know that those dollars are recirculating locally. We don't have to guess. And then, and it's okay to do that, because if the ideas are big and good enough, if we can show examples and sort of set some precedents, then they can be replicated. And here I said by invitation in other local communities. In other words, it's not up to us to take our show on the road and try to sell it everywhere. It is up to us to show people, to demonstrate that it works. And then by example, hopefully we're invited to come in and do work in other places. So that worked a lot better than just trying to sort of impose your ideas elsewhere. And then finally, trust the people that are responsible for making the vision a reality. Look to non-traditional measures to determine trust. We know that a lot of people, for example, operate outside of the standard financial system. So if you're looking for a savings account record for 5 years, you may not see it. But if you really consider what that person has, set aside and has been able to fund on their own without borrowing, that tells you something. And I think that, a lot of times we as funders think we know best or think we know better, when in fact, you have to trust in the person that's bringing the idea to you, the project to you, and you have to believe in that vision. You have to see it through their eyes and not just sort of through your own, which can be tainted. So if you're going to spend time, don't necessarily try to make things look like the traditional rules, but really interrogate that vision itself and what are the assumptions behind it. And a really big one is assume that things take the time they take. Everybody wants stuff to happen in a 12-month or 24-month period, and sometimes that's just not the reality. Unfortunately, there are ways to invest that don't force you into some of those false time frames. And then maybe one of my favorites is invest in people doing what they do best. How many times have we seen an entrepreneur or community entrepreneur be really good at something, really good at running a food bank and getting the best deal, and then the banker comes in and says, "Yeah, but we want you to create these financial statements every month and turn those in." So now you're trying to turn this really good food bank operator into an accountant. And that's not who they are, and that's not what they do best. So now they're staying up nights trying to figure out stupid financial statement instead of doing what you invested in them to do, which is to run a really good food bank and maximize benefit both to the community and to the business. So one of my mentors once said, don't try to make a pig sing, because it makes a horrible noise and it irritates the pig. So, really understand what people do and how they best do it. And that's what we need to invest in. So I'm going to stop there because we have some other folks on this panel, but that's just sort of a been in the trenches, best 3 words of advice that I would share with anyone looking at decolonizing financialization. And here's my contact information if you want to do more. There are some slides at the end which we'll share about the Democracy Collaborative. I'm not going to go through those at all, but just to let you know that they're there. And with that, I will stop.
Steph McHenry, thank you so very much. I always learn so much from you, and I am so eager to get into this conversation. And next, I'm going to bring the next panelist into the conversation. Ruben Omar Hernandez is a dedicated investor, an entrepreneur, an engineer, a philanthropist, currently serves as managing partner at Full Spectrum Capital Management and Full Spectrum Capital Partners. Ruben oversees the management and deployment of a diverse portfolio across the globe, comprising private equity, debt, grants, and venture capital projects. At the core of Ruben's philosophy lies the belief in active participation in the ownership and sustainability of our entire planet's systems. He sees money as a tool to empower humanity, enabling us to address our most pressing challenges while fostering harmony with the earth and each other. Throughout the past decade, Ruben has been actively investing in technology startups funded by social impact-driven entrepreneurs. In 2019, Ruben founded Full Spectrum Capital Partners with a bold mission to mobilize, get this, $1 trillion to nurture early-stage entrepreneurial ecosystems with high social, environmental, and economic returns. Ruben's dedicated to creating positive change continues to drive his efforts towards building a more sustainable and equitable world. And I can tell you from personal experience, he means every word of that biography. Ruben, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you, David. And Stephanie, could you put your slides again? I think I'm gonna do some improv here. So we can, I love the 3 big points and love to just work with that. And so that I'm not introducing any new language to our guests here. And maybe I can give some examples on how in the practice that in my day-to-day that how this is looking like at Full Spectrum, because I love what you're doing there. So the first point is resist, right? Resist pressure to assimilate. And this is something that we constantly do at Full Spectrum when it comes to investments. And what Full Spectrum Capital is essentially is the full stack of capital, from grants, from philanthropy, private equity, loans and debt, and venture capital. And like Stephanie said, we don't want to turn a food bank person into an accountant. And we see that over and over and over again in the finance industry, specifically in venture capital. My colleagues in venture capital, we're sort of this oddballs in venture capital because we don't like to assimilate to this whole concept of having control and having control over the vision, having control over the operations, having control over the way that entrepreneurs wanna see their businesses or their nonprofits or their social enterprise. We at Full Spectrum believe in being of service to the founders, to the entrepreneurs, to the innovators. So this is a huge resist kind of a mode that we have all the time, because most venture capital managers are looking for that control. They're looking for the way to control the exits, control the liquidation events, control the way that the entrepreneurs are building their companies or building their organizations. And this is really important in terms of resisting that pressure to assimilate to typical venture capital, typical private equity. Private equity is even more adamant about control, and sharing is not really a something that private equity looks to do. So when you're in relationship with venture capital or private equity, capital is a very difficult relationship to be in if the capitalist is not really looking to share and looking to let go of control. And you know, this happens also in philanthropy. Philanthropy tends to have the same kind of mentality of control over vision, control over operations, control over team, control over communities. And you're gonna hear my sister Elizabeth talk a little bit more about her model in a little bit, but and being in right relationship is really, really important when it comes to decolonizing finance. And decolonizing means just let go of control, share more of the responsibilities, the risks, and the returns that will eventually come if we are more intentional about really not extracting from one another. So resist pressure to assimilate. I love this. We've been doing this. It takes a lot of work, though. It's really exhausting too on the capital side. to be resisting the approaches, the mindsets, because it's you become an other. Like in the venture capital industry, there's a lot of othering happening. There's very little belonging. And I just recently read a book by John A. Powell, Othering and Belonging, and it really helped me a lot understanding this sort of concept of doing so much work to belong, to be part of, and resisting is sort of in the DNA of many capital activists like myself. So thank you for that, and that's I just wanted to say that that's really something that is a lot of work that we need to do on the capital side to really demonstrate how to be in the right relationship with entrepreneurs, innovators, nonprofit leaders. The next big point was, yes. When we talk about equity investments, specifically equity investments, and now increasingly more and more, philanthropy is becoming really I would say intoxicated with this scale up, scale everything, right? Everything scale. When you have a mindset of scaling your hyper local and hyper local relationships, they just go down the wayside. There's very little value that capital providers or funders see when there is your local farm, your local shop, your local restaurant. It doesn't attract the capital that's out there that is returns when profit maximization is the purpose of an institution, a capital institution. Hyper local is extremely difficult to do. But what we've done at Full Spectrum is flip it. We believe in community, we believe in networks, we believe in ecosystems. So if you're doing something, if Oakland is doing something locally, and they're solving some big problems, let's join a bigger movement. One of the organizations that we work with very closely with is Obran Collective. And Obran is a worker cooperative organization based in Baltimore, and they do a lot of worker cooperative movement. And what they're doing is flipping this hyperlocals, be hyperlocal, or be part of a larger organization where all of the workers are, so they also own sort of this whole company. And this is something that has already been done in mainstream and Wall Street. Things like special purpose acquisition companies or natural asset companies. Those are assets that are out there, and they're billions of dollars into their cap table. However, is continuing this cycle of accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few and control in the hands of the few. But by doing more of decentralized ownership of large organizations, like what we call a special purpose community corporation, where community becomes owner of a massive holding company, and you can stay local and receive support from your nodes in your network. And so we're looking at that. We're looking at studios. How do we make investments into venture studios, venture incubators that are really connected in a network level, at a global level, not just U.S. And that's really important that we connect with our brothers and sisters outside of the U.S. so that the companies become more valuable at the local level and at the multi-global level, at the multinational level. So this hyper local is really important, because that's really where the relationships are, the insights that we get from relationships that have been around for hundreds of years, and even sometimes in some communities thousands of years. a lot of wisdom is been thrown to the wayside because a lot of capital is focused on hyper scale and hyper individualism, and not looking at the value of the hyper local and the relationships that are so important at the hyper local level. Your next slide. I'm loving this, Stephanie. Thank you for making my talk a little easier. Trust, yes. Whew, trust. So this goes back to control and sharing. What we have done at Full Spectrum is start with the end beneficiary first. So who is going to benefit from all the great work, all the solutions, all the movement, all the energy that we put in into solving these big problems like climate change and the maternal health crisis, and you name the problem. We always start with who ends up benefiting from anything that we do. Center Equity is a coalition, a network of birth center leaders across the U.S. that are creating, building, and expanding birth centers, freestanding birth centers owned by community members. And the way we've invested into birth centers is by setting up trust, by setting actual trust, legal trust, where the ultimate beneficiary of the work or the upside, so that profit maximization can be removed from the equation, and we focus on ensuring that our midwives, our birth workers, our babies, our mothers, they're all taken care of in a communal way, in a midwifery model way. So having trust is really where you see trust is really in the ownership of companies and the governance of organizations, nonprofit organizations, and the ownership and control of for-profit companies. That's where trust can be manifested, and that's where capitalists like myself and others that are part of a movement of capitalists, we can really make a change by being in the right relationship with all the folks that we're working with. So I'll stop there, David. Yes, and thank you, Stephanie. That was awesome.
And thank you, Ruben, for those words. I'm so much looking forward to getting into this conversation. And with that, I'll invite our next conversationalist into the conversation, and that is Elizabeth Garlow, who serves as the co-founder of the Francesco Collaborative. The Francesco Collaborative invites investors to show up as their spiritually rooted selves, with deep vulnerability and a commitment to critique the structural problems of our existing global economy and to dare to dream about a role in its transformation. Through Elizabeth's work, she supports protagonists of transformation that seek to draw on shared lineages of faith, spirituality, and wisdom to shape a new economy. Elizabeth is also a senior fellow at New America, where she focuses on structural reform and imagines new ways of building an economy rooted in well-being. She previously championed and led impact investing for the Lumina Foundation. She served as policy advisor with the Obama administration. She co-founded a Detroit-based nonprofit called Michigan Core, which invested specifically in social entrepreneurs. She studied political economy at Kalamazoo College, completed her graduate work in public policy and economics at Princeton University, and was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. Elizabeth now lives in Michigan, where she's enjoying getting reacquainted with the Great Lakes and apprenticing with urban farmers in Detroit. Elizabeth, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, David. My fellow conversationalists shared a lot of really rich wisdom, so I'm going to keep this pretty succinct. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this conversation. This is the right conversation to be having. I'm sort of an unlikely finance person. I didn't come up in this world as someone who had experience in traditional industry. I actually grew up in a lot of Catholic social justice circles. So part of what you heard in my background around faith and spiritual tradition really is, I think, what has shaped my worldview and my longing to root this question of how we shift our financial paradigm in spirituality and as part of a spiritual inquiry. I spent time in Latin America when I was an undergraduate student. I was incredibly disillusioned with kind of mainstream neoclassical economics education that is so characteristic of most of our American colleges and universities. And it was really there, kind of immersed in alternative schools of thought around economics, that my sort of the scales fell from my eyes. And I felt, especially through research that I did in Brazil, that I wanted to really root my work in this realm of finance and economics in a relational paradigm and in the relationships that really I think are the, so essential to kind of a thriving life and thriving communities. So what does that look like for me? There are just a few things that kind of in preparing for this conversation today, I wanted to share with you all. Today, I accompany a number of asset stewards, often from institutions of faith, but also others, individuals and other institutional investors who really are awakening to kind of, as David said, this idea that they might be protagonists in kind of transforming the dominant logic around finance, which is rooted in what we call capital supremacy. So the dominant logic is to return more capital to those who already have access to it. Steph's colleague, Marjorie Kelly's recent book, Wealth Supremacy, names this so clearly and so well, that really the purpose of finance today is to maximize finance and to exercise a bias toward capital. And so what would it take to shift that? One thing that the book title is called Wealth Supremacy. So one thing that would shift that, that we really focus on in our community is this kind of shared inquiry around moving from a logic of maximization to an embodied ethic of enoughness. This question, what is enough? And that is a very hard question for a culture that is so rooted in and steeped in maximization of personal preference, maximization of luxury. And I think part of what we are really recognizing is that there are a number of creative mechanisms by which groups are embodying this ethic of enoughness, figuring out ways to cap financial returns for investors and redistribute financial returns among an array of community stakeholders. It really comes down to a lot of what I think Morgan Simon has written about very well in her book, Real Impact, which is really thinking about how we more equitably distribute risk and return. We have a model of finance today that concentrates risk on the investee and maximizes return for the investor. And there are so many ways that we can structurally innovate to really rethink, and Ruben is doing so much of this work so beautifully, to really rethink how we redistribute risk and return. Another thing we look at is how we move from a dominant ethic of security and safety to an ethic of risk. And this is also really tricky in our dominant paradigm of finance because we use language like risk-adjusted returns, which really looks at a very narrow definition of risk, which typically includes things like track record of having received investments or managed investments before, or other certain conditions that might maximize for the safety, security, and financial return potential of an investment. Well, that will keep resources flowing in the directions they've always flowed. And so we have to interrogate how we think about and conceptualize risk. And we have to also ask ourselves, what is the risk of not having a livable future? This is what we ask our community. How do we actually wildly expand how we think about and our consciousness around risk? I would argue that this kind of shifting of our consciousness around our inherited logic and our trauma around money is spiritual work. It is really tough work to look at our broken system and reimagine a different kind of future. And it needs ritual, I think. So we try to practice a lot of that in our community. We talk about ways that we might welcome money as a mirror and a teacher that reveals to us the ongoing work that we are invited to do to engage in personal transformation and service of a more just world. And we talk about how the ways that we continue to operate out of this worldview of scarcity, and how might we move to a worldview of sufficiency and of flow, rather than that of fear and hoarding. We also, I think, recognize that this isn't just about ritual. This is really also about encounter, this culture of encuentro. It's this idea that in opening ourselves up to being in relationship, and Ruben mentioned this, we do a lot of work with our community around this concept of right relationship. It's what kind of formation can we have through the encounters we have with those who are sort of, on the margins of dominant positions of power and privilege, and recognize that our social education and those kinds of encounters are actually incredibly rich grounds from which to transform our financial paradigm. There is so much gatekeeping in this world of finance, so much jargon that is used that keeps people at bay. And part of what we try to do is really invite in the lived wisdom and the social education of many different people to really center that as a path to daring to imagine something different. So I think at the core, this is about our relationship with others. I really appreciated Steph's point around localizing finance, because it is in our proximate relationships that we can engage in mutual forms of aid and support. But at its core, I think this is really about belonging in community. It's about sharing power, acting in community, liberating others from unjust structures. So it's also a little bit about what Ruben spoke about in terms of centering the end beneficiary in our financing flow. So we can really ask, we could ask, what does our investment do to others? But we could also ask, what does this investment say about our relationship with others? And then lastly, I would just say, I think we have to do this work in community. It is really essential for us to have a conversation today about what repair looks like. I don't think we'll get very far in decolonizing finance until we have really reckoned with legacies of harm and done meaningful reparative finance work, and recognizing that trust is gained as we give it. And practicing this new kind of ethic together is much more possible than alone. So we are trying to do things like invite people into investor circles where they can journey together to minimize burden for investees by sharing of diligence, sharing of resources, but also just recognizing that there is such a need for more transparency and sharing of wisdom and resources in this space to bring more capital in to the solidarity economy. And so we can get a lot more creative with the sort of legal frameworks we're using, the diligence frameworks we're using to invite more participation in. And a lot of the innovation I'm seeing around this is happening at the individual finance level. So looking at, I'm sure many people in this virtual space know radical planners, right? A lot of individual financial planners that are engaging in incredibly collaborative structures to really say, hey, this whole financial planning industry, we need a radical reimagination of that. The more we try to lean into a different ethic, the more kind of pushback we get given conventional business model structures and how to make it work. So let's try something different. Let's try more horizontal forms of collaboration. I think we need more of this kind of innovation and collaboration on the institutional side as well. So very excited for the conversation here. Thank you.
And thank you, Elizabeth. We want to also thank KMUD, our local community radio station here in Wiyot Ancestral Territory, who's simulcasting this live. I want to thank Free Speech TV, who is broadcasting us over the airwaves. But for those of you who are watching and participating in the conversation in real time, I want to invite you to utilize the chat, as some of you have done, to ask questions, engage in a conversation. And so let's bring, Nicola, if you could, all of the panelists together. And let's actually start by first acknowledging that April writes in to thank you, Elizabeth, for naming the spiritual side of this. And then I want to take this opportunity also for myself to point out that each of you talked about values in different ways. And how ironic it is that I've never met anyone who says, my values are around oppressing other people. My values are around extracting from them. My values are around dominating. Like, that just isn't part of how people think. And yet that's how the investment system of capitalism works. So my question to each of you, honestly, is how can we rethink finance and an economic system as one of balance and flow, and get it back to the regenerative idea that I think all of us as humans carry for ourselves? And I know that's kind of a big provocative question, but I really do want to, I promised people that this was going to be real talk. So that's real talk. How can we actually take an economic system that is fundamentally premised on extraction, exploitation, domination, and shift the whole thing?
I'll start if you're interested. I can start with that. Well, I think what we have to recognize is that we have been propagandized our entire life to believe that capitalism is something holy and sacred in America. And it's been done so cleverly that if you ever question it in any way whatsoever, you get all the labels, and you get, it's not McCarthy anymore, but pretty close, right? You get pushed off to the side and accused of not understanding. I loved Elizabeth's point about, bankers and the financials use all this jargon just to make you feel like you don't understand what's going on. So two things. We have to realize that the reason that it feels so natural, like water to us, is because the propaganda we've received our whole lives said that this is normal. This is the normal way that the world works. So what are you talking about? There's a problem. Second thing I think we have to do is unpack how capital perpetuates. When we go into a committee and say, you're participating in an extractive economy, huh? So what? But when we go in a committee and say, the reason that you can only make $2.50 an hour as a waitress is because this chain that you work for is trying to get as much money out of this business as they can to give to somebody that already has a bunch of money, who will never see your face. That's why things are going the way they're going for you. It's not that you are doing something wrong or you didn't go to school long enough and all, this system. So I think demystifying the system and debunking it as something sacred, when it really is the stellar opposite of, or the polar opposite of sacred. So I'll stop there. About to get on a soapbox.
I love those points, Steph. Maybe just to build on that a little bit, I do think there is much of what you're saying about demystifying the system makes me think about the stories we tell about the system and how it works and what a good life is. And I really think a lot of this work is about cultural transformation and new narrative building. And so I really just want to challenge all of us to think about what is the new story we want to write and we're trying to write, and how do we write that collectively in ways that really grow, empower, and influence? Because we have a story right now that is still pretty dominant, which says that the more we own, the better off we are. And the more we can accumulate, the better off we are, right? And the more money we have, the better off we are. And so where is there space in that story for enoughness? Where is there space for gift? Where is there space for shared well-being, collective well-being, alongside individual well-being? So that's one thing. The other thing that came to mind is just the work of Adrienne Maree Brown's work around emergent strategy, and the number of people that have been seeking to apply that and reflecting on the necessity of both decentralized communities of practice who are operating according to a different ethic, as well as top-down reforms. Ruben was mentioning this perverse outsized influence of private equity. It has hollowed out our middle economy. It has cost a ton of, decent wage jobs. And so we absolutely need financial sector reform and political reform and policies that limit the impacts of private equity in our financial markets, but we also need people who are future casting, who are really thinking differently about different forms of finance. And both of those need to meet in order to sort of shift the system. I also, I guess I want to encourage us too to really take seriously alternative forms of governance and ownership, which I know, David is so well kind of versed on, but there are ways that many people have been seeking to kind of model an alternative to an extractive economy, right? We know this. There are, and Ruben mentioned Oberon, there are so many wonderful sort of pioneers in the shared ownership and employee ownership movement. And I think there is kind of a moment right now where people are coming together and asking, okay, what does it take to bring resources at a greater scale to nourish those forms of ownership and redesign enterprises accordingly, right? As a kind of antidote to the extractive economy. So I'm sure, yeah, much more conversation maybe to have on that point.
I shared a link in the text for the, I'm part of a network of philanthropists. It's called the Good Life Pledge, so Buen Vivir. And essentially the purpose of the Good Life Pledge is to give up control of at least 30% of the assets that each of the pledgers own, and give that control to community. Whatever community is defined, however they define community, each member can define community as they see fit. But the main thing here for a shift is to accept that we are part of this very extractive system, and second, stop just being part of the system. And one way that I've done it is by taking this pledge, be part of a community that is not being apologetic about it. Like, we are taking actions with our own assets, with our own capital assets, and we are figuring out ways to share governance and control of those assets so that we can all create wealth, taking risks and enjoying the returns together. So it starts with each individual one of us to make the shift. And I think the 3 big points that Stephanie shared, the book is amazing, the Wealth Supremacy book. I read that book, and it was so therapeutic. It was so therapeutic to just hear what I've, personally have been going through for the past 30 years, just not really understanding why philanthropy works the way it works, why private equity is working the way it works, why venture capital works the way, but I had to live it myself. But I don't think all of us have to do that in order to make a change and just let go of control and share power with our neighbors, share power with our kids, with our cousins, with our family members. It starts at home, I think.
Thank you all. I'm going to go right into the chat. Callie makes this point. Risk to whom is a good question. The people who make financing decisions almost always don't represent the communities that need wealth building, redistribution, and reparation. So I want to lean into this idea of risk to whom and invite each of you if you have any thoughts on that notion.
Well, I guess we'll keep going in order here, kind of. I mean, to directly answer the question, it's risk to the people that put the capital in play. That's how we're organized as an economy. So if you have capital, you have money, and you let it out of your stingy little hands and you put it somewhere, the minute you let go of it, that you've now taken some risk as to whether you get it back. So that's the traditional thought. The thing we've been very delinquent about, or very dumb, honestly, in not considering is, what are the risks on things that you can't measure as capital? What's the risk to letting communities go to crap? What's the risk of killing the environment? Those are all risks, but no one person owns that. So it's hard it's hard for people to get there, but because it seems invisible, it's hard for people to assign some face to it and say, I'm really, this is harm, this is a loss here. So so I'll just stop there. So the traditional risk is the one that lets go of the money. What should be considered as risk is also the impacts on things that are a lot harder to manage than or measure than dollars and cents.
Yeah, I think to this comment here, I think there is this, perceived risk versus actual risk is a really great point. And I think our risk models are really poorly equipped to incorporate various forms of systemic risk, as much as we hear kind of a growing focus on things like climate risk but the reality is there's a tremendous amount of artificiality in our financial markets. And so if anyone's interested, I would really encourage you to check out a course that I will drop in the chat here, taught by Marco Vangelesti, one of the kind of founders of the slow money movement, who does a tremendous job sort of breaking down just exactly how our financial markets are constructed and the claims on real assets that vastly exceed actual GDP numbers. And so if you think about, there is just tremendous systemic risk in the entire system, right? Which is not at all kind of incorporated or quantified. But back to this, some of my earlier points around risk, I really think a lot of this points us in the direction of thinking about forms of sharing power through participatory forms of investing. I dropped a toolkit in the chat from Common Future, participatory investing toolkit that folks might be interested in checking out. And I think there's just tremendous room for kind of new ways to bring community members into investment decision-making committees, also really involved in finding investments in communities. So part of what I'm really interested in is the ways that groups might be shifting control of their assets and their decision-making around investments to more community-oriented forms of governance and decision-making. And some of the faith communities that I work with that are transitioning their assets are looking at those kinds of models or have engaged in those kinds of models. And to me, that is a radical step in the direction of decolonizing finance, is to say, we're going to invite in more people to have governance, ownership, and decision-making over these resources.
I'll just say that, and I put it in the chat, risk is equal fear of losing control. That is, and when I think of risk, I think of, let's just say we all had the money that we needed to do whatever we wanted. Would we take a risk in a relationship? Would we take time to meet our neighbors? Would we take time to start a project with our cousins? Would we take time? It's really, we need to move away from capital risk to and really embrace the risk of being in relationship with one another, because money doesn't have any say on relationships. It doesn't have any power on true relationships, on true community care, on true rewards. Like if we're gonna go for a trip, if we're gonna go on a trip and we gotta bring money, I mean, the risk of going on that trip, there's so many risks. And it could be like the person that you're taking the trip with just goes crazy during the trip, and there you go, you lost an opportunity, you lost an experience. So what is the perceived risk, and this also goes back to what Elizabeth was saying in terms of capital risk. The whole middle layer of management of money. So registered investment advisors, wealth advisors, fund managers, bankers, anyone who is dealing with somebody else's money, they're the ones who need to ensure that they don't lose the money. So they don't take they don't take risk the way that they should be taking risk, because they're not in relationship with those communities. So it's a high risk to be investing in a Black community in the South when there's need of housing and food and water. There's even higher risk if you go to the Congo, or if you go to the middle of the Amazons, the risk is you can't even calculate it. When you're a middle manager, you're an intermediary between those who are holding assets and those who need those assets to work on those assets. So it's really important to really focus on the intermediaries and the whole industry, because they're the ones who are defining perceived risk, because they're the ones who are not in relationship in relationship to community. Their relationship to their customers, who are the paying customers, that happen to be investment banks, pension funds, government, nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, you name it. So there's a big reform that needs to happen. There's a human reform. It's a way of thinking on where risk really lies. So I'll stop there.
And I'll also say that, and I really want to lift up Ruben, because Ruben has been a mentor and a teacher for me to rethink how I think about money. I love to tell this story, Ruben, that you and Taj, I still remember, it was, I don't know, about 5 years ago in a conversation, and you said, look, we're going to teach you how to stop thinking about $1,000 or $10,000 at a time. We see you as a community steward. We see what you're doing. We know what you're capable of. We know we see your lifetime history. And you said, we're going to teach you to stop thinking about 10,000 at a time and to start thinking about $100,000 at a time. And then you're going to start thinking about $1 million at a time. And then you'll be thinking about $10 million at a time. And I remember thinking, you're crazy. This doesn't make any sense. And what I've realized is my own limits of imagination and my, frankly, fear of money and my fear of people who have accumulated money and my distrust of them, which I could go into all sorts of personal, very real reasons that I came out of this as somebody who came up and out of poverty. But the reality is that I have come to embrace the idea that letting it go, both for myself and for others, and to say, this is like water. I need to flow, and we need to just have these conversations. And frankly, I'll keep bumping up against the people that I can do this work with. And when they're ready, they will appear. And I feel like Indigenous people have helped me to really embrace, do it the right way. If you do things the right way, and if you're around enough Indigenous people, you'll hear that phrase in so many ways. Do it the right way. Do it in the right way. Pray with your hands, and it will come. And I want to shift into another comment, and this is for the folks with public sector experience. And I think it's a very powerful question. What degree of consciousness is there amongst your peers or former peers in government that our current extractive economic ways are failing people and planet at large? None at all? A little? Where is that? That's a great question. And I'm curious because I'm usually on the outside of government, right? So in your experience, and let's just take Steph, I think you're right. We'll go Steph, Elizabeth, Ruben through the course of our conversations. Do a little good old-fashioned sociocracy.
Yeah. So I think when I think about I've never worked in the public sector other than when I was CFO and head of business affairs for Cleveland State University. So we were a state university, therefore we reported up through the state of Ohio. I think that where you see some progress, hopefulness, is on the procurement side. Some of those state governmental agencies and entities are trying to behave as better citizens, as anchor institutions by doing things like procuring from minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses. You'll see some of that on the investment side too. Many of them have goals now around socially responsible investments. So I think that there's some consciousness, but not too radical, right? Because those folks are stuck. We all are stuck. We're stuck in the scenario of maximizing return on even those public dollars. So there's only so much outside of the box that we were allowed to go. So I'll stop there.
I had a friend and mentor I was talking to last week said, Elizabeth, just remember that most institutions are like a baked cookie. They're kind of like a closed loop system. And once you've baked the cookie, you can't really take it apart. You can't really deconstruct it. And when I think about a lot of our government institutions, many of them are closed loop systems, right? There are sort of embedded processes, ways of working, cultural norms, et cetera, that do make it quite hard, I think, to shift, and often a lot of what we see in here to kind of tends in the direction, not of post-growth economics, for example, but more like equitable growth. So I think I do want to share, though, I recently learned about there have been, as we know, in the pandemic, there were kind of unprecedented levels of flexible federal capital that were flowing to places, which have been catalytic for some groups of, multi-stakeholder groups to come together and do long-term visioning, future forecasting, try to break down silos, et cetera. And the Economic Development Administration had done this grant program called Build Back Better, regional grants. Some of you may know about those. What I learned is, as part of that, they really tried to create feedback loops with communities. And there was a Native Community Development Finance Institution Coalition that said, hey, if you're going to do this again, you need to get rid of matching funding requirements, because every time government imposes that on communities, you really crowd out a lot of groups and you really make it hard for communities who are suffering the most to tap into these public funds. And I just learned that the Economic Development Administration just launched their We Compete pilot grant and they got rid of it. So I guess part of what I'm wondering about is how we poke holes in closed loop systems to create new feedback loops, to invite in forms of participation and feedback from communities that can start to shift those types of financing or technical resources in ways that benefit communities much more. And the federal government just issued a request for feedback on a participation framework that they're developing. So I will drop the link to that in the chat too. If any of you are in communities or groups that can provide comment on that, I think this is the time to galvanize as much responses as we can. Again, just to try and poke holes kind of in those closed loop systems.
I just dropped a picture and a link to the Excessive Wealth Disorder Institute. It's actually a thing. And the picture shows you what all these individuals that have realized how excessive wealth has impacted their lives. So they're toying around a lot with, changing policy, doing tax reform, doing all this amazing work that they're doing. But the one conversation that's not part of that is community wealth building and community wealth power. What is the power of community? There were some comments in the chat about the power of when we're collectively work to make a change in the system. And that's really through community wealth. So if we continue sharing the industry, the financial industry it rewards individualism, doesn't reward collectivism, rewards monopolism, doesn't reward anything that is decentralized. It's very biased towards this, and then government has been co-opted with them. The tax system has been designed or redesigned to really favor individualism versus collectivism. So the real power and the real change will happen by being more open to community wealth building and sharing. And that's the financial industry, financial advisors, financial planners, wealth advisors, fund managers that have control over trillions and trillions of assets. Who are you really working for? Are you really working for your community, or you're working for the billionaires in Europe and here? And that's the colonial way. That's just the colonial way of doing things. Just work for the man, work for the continue building wealth for those who you call your colonizers.
I promise y'all real talk, and there it is. There's another what I consider to be a provocative question, and provocative in the good way, and it goes like this: a request from the panelist opinion on the current state and potential of the socially responsible investment community to actually transition and build a true solidarity economy.
Well, I know enough to be dangerous, but so my answer is going to be kind of short here. I have to do a shout out, and Elizabeth, you'll appreciate this. When I was at Shore Bank, when that bank started in the 70s, we were one of the first organizations to create a socially responsible investment tool. I think Calvert was there too. And guess who the first investors were? Catholic orders of nuns. You know, that so since then, you know, there have been people that understood all sides of this. I am a little bit familiar, Ruben, with the, you know, the, what is it, the people with too much money. What's it called? The I forgot the name.
Excessive wealth.
Excessive wealth disorder. Exactly. Yeah, they've been in touch with Marjorie. So, and I love that as a concept. Honestly, from what I can see, I think it's just time for more innovation. I think there's even more finance that could go towards some of the things we've been talking about. You know, how do you package stuff that really gets invested very locally with the kind of outcomes that we want to see, and at the same time have a reasonable return, a reasonable amount of return. So I think people are I'll say one more thing. I think people are realizing that we can't keep doing what we're doing. That, you know, the system that we've operated in has not helped enough people. So I think there's more openness to think about doing something different. I'll stop there.
It's a big question that I toss and turn over almost every day. I mean, I honestly think the philanthropic sector is woefully behind and risk averse in ways that continue to really fail the solidarity economy, right? For people who have what should be kind of risk tolerant capital. I'm quite interested in a couple of things that I just feel like haven't really been tapped for the solidarity economy, which includes unlocking donor advised funds. I think there's just a tremendous amount of capital that really just, you know, tax advantaged capital that sits on the sidelines, and how do we transition those to community advised funds is like an interesting question. I think regional community foundations, you know, these place-based kind of re-granting organizations that organize donors and build pools of resources are also very under leveraged for this sector and space, and probably don't have much awareness or kind of consciousness around the work. I do feel like there has been a tremendous kind of growth in social justice oriented intermediaries, like funds that give decision-making power over distribution of your giving to people who are impacted by issues. So for those who are, you know, conscious and want to find pathways for resources to flow, I think there are better advisors and intermediaries than existed before. But of course, the scale of capital is nowhere near where the need is, right? I mean, there's so many of us that continue to struggle to figure out how you drive in more capital. I think two sort of things that I've seen recently that I just find interesting. So one is this phenomenon in kind of public markets finance around direct indexing, right? So you know that most of the money that flows into public markets is already kind of indexed. There are mutual funds. There's not a lot of control that you might have as an individual over how those resources flow, but there are groups like Odyssey, Social Capital that are building customized kind of indices that really are about being accountable to social and popular movements. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. And then I do think there are ways that this conversation is starting to shift to what many are calling like an impact first model, right? There's just more robust conversation happening about how you bring in more capital that lives between 0% and market rate like, again, it goes back to this question of what is enough, how much of a return is actually enough versus trying to benchmark to these market rates for which, like, if we continue to benchmark to those market rates, we are really in trouble because the inputs that go into those benchmarks are what are putting us on the path of deep social and ecological harm and destruction. So we have to really reconceptualize kind of, you know, how we think about returns and where capital is flowing.
David, I tend to just not give an opinion about movements. They're complex. They are messy, and they're great. So when it comes to social impact investors, what I always look at is the term sheets. What kind of terms are they writing when they're making investments, and where's their money coming from? Because a lot of social impact investors are just using that essentially, that they already got their tax break, so they're not pressured to get another return on that. But then they're pressuring the entrepreneurs and the founders of social enterprises and cooperatives and whatnot to give them a return. So it's really I like to see those things. Anytime I see a social impact investor, like, let me see the terms that you want to come into, and are the terms defined by them, the social impact investor, or by the community or the enterprise that is receiving the capital? That's one. And two is, where's your money coming from? Is it money that you already paid taxes on, or is it money that you haven't paid taxes on, and you're basically sheltering your money and recycling your money in the way that you can control the money and control the relationship? So there'd be no solidarity if there's no good terms for the community.
One of the things that has always struck me is this idea that, like, look, let's be honest, y'all. Like, if there is a huge, big pile of money, that big pile of money has accumulated at blood, sweat, tears, extraction. You don't get, like, in fact, I'm gonna break it down like this. Many of you know I'm country, right? Like, I grew up in the rural South, and Daddy used to have this saying. He said, "Son, if you get a big old pile of money, it's a lot like cow manure, and if you pile it up in one place, it smells like what it really is. But you know what? If you spread that around the farm, you can do a whole lot of good with it." And that's really stuck with me, and really is in the back of my mind as I'm listening to all of this. And I really think that what we have to do is tell a narrative and a story about flow and about letting go of both money and power. And I'm talking about myself as well as those people who are like, I have to learn to trust that I have to learn to engage in a process that lets myself flow in a different kind of way. And, and again, I look at each one of the other panelists, and I know that I'm already learning from each of you, some more than others, just because I've in longer relationship with some of you. But I do want to get back to this idea of, like, attracting what it is that we need, right? And this is back to your point about terms, Ruben. Like, if I bump at what I've been learning is, as I'm working on these projects that I know have genuine transformational catalytic impact, and somebody is coming at me with, well, how do I get to market rate returns? I've just become very clear that's like, I don't think that we really are talking about the same thing. So, like, and I guess I'll say it this way. If you cherry pick individual projects, you might be able to get market rate returns, but I don't think that you can transform our entire society that way. So to me, I'm looking for people who share my vision, and that I can trust, because we can move at the speed of trust. And so I don't even know if this is a question to the panel so much as just what's coming up for me in this conversation. And some of it is me acknowledging my own need to let go.
Yeah, I mean, we have our 401ks, right? we want to retire someday, and we want to earn enough to stop working at a certain age, and that requires a certain amount of return. So it's in all of us, and as you said at one point, it doesn't all look like the big bad devil coming at you. Sometimes you look in the mirror and see it. But I think Elizabeth's point, and Ruben's as well, we just have to tell a different story. And we have to get better at it. We have to be as good as telling our story as the folks that have propagandized us for all this time have been telling theirs.
David, I so appreciate the ways you bring it back to like, what is my work to do? Because I feel like so much of this, it's like, it's easy to other investors or to other wealth hoarders or to other institutions. And so much of this, I think, like transforming our collective consciousness around this does begin with each one of us. And I feel really resonant with that, like been on a similar path. I think part of this in my own life too has been trusting in the flow of gift and thinking about a gift economy differently, and where possible, trying to be a conduit for gift for others, right? So I think there are just ways, like I'm really inspired by the work of Janelle Orsi and the Sustainable Economies Law Center, just trying to create new kind of like doing the legal work to create pathways for resources to flow more freely to people that might not align to the particular constraints imposed by institutional investors, right? I just think there's so much more we can be doing to just unlock, unleash, and flow resources. And part of like what Ruben's been doing with, I don't know if folks caught this earlier, but the structuring of funds such that you create vehicles within the fund that have community beneficiaries as owners of those vehicles, like the benefits are accruing to those beneficiaries. Like there are just ways in our structures that we can be trying to allow money to flow as gift to more people.
Ruben, do you have anything that you want to share on this?
No, I was dropping a whole bunch of books that I've been reading, but when you were saying about looking at yourself and your colonized mind and how to decolonize your own mind, I just thought of Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed, and I think that he puts it in the best way possible. I read Paulo like 20 years ago, and it's still applicable for me in my life, with constantly thinking who is the oppressed and who's the oppressor in every transaction that I do, because if we stay transactional, which is what the financial industry forces us to do, and we're not relational, there's going to be an oppressed and there's going to be an oppressor, no matter what, and it's always a zero-sum game. So there's no solidarity on that, and even within the solidarity economy practitioners, if there's that oppressed and oppressor, colonizing colonizer relationship, I mean, it doesn't matter. We could be blaming an industry, but it's in our day-to-day relationships and interactions with one another that make a difference. And then there's the term sheet.
Trust but verify. Y'all, our time together has just flown by, and I feel so grateful to each of you for what you've shared. I do want to give each one of our panelists an opportunity for final thoughts, and to also encourage you to share how folks can either get in touch with your own organization, any ways that you might invite continued dialogue and conversation. And we'll just do the same order. Steph?
Well, thank you, David, for again inviting me in. Elizabeth and Ruben, it's been wonderful to be alongside you, and hope our paths cross maybe in 3D even someday. I would just say that, there are great opportunities for finance and for supporting things that are important, things that can make money for folks, enough money, and that don't have to break the backs of others. I'll look at somebody that put a comment in about the graying of entrepreneurs. I'm very excited about that in Cleveland. We're going to have a whole bunch of businesses turning over that people have invested lives in and have great customer bases and have run well, that have a chance to be minority owned. The Evergreen Laundry that we helped start however many 15 years ago is now among the top 3 largest minority owned businesses in the region, meaning that, so this story can happen over and over again. We just had, and so there's a fund set up to finance some of that. And I think that's a good story. I don't think that it's always a zero-sum game, either return or good work. It can be both. And we just have to stick to it. And our day has come. Our day has come. We should have to spend a lot less time convincing folks at this point and just be able to just get about the work. So great to be with you.
Steph, your work is so legendary. It's so wonderful to hear you look back a little bit too, because I think it gives perspective to the movement, right? To be able to see like what was the spark of this like community wealth building work in Cleveland and how it's grown is really an inspiration. So thank you. I think I want to encourage folks, like there have been a ton of books and resources and great things dropped in the chat. And so much of this work for me began in community with others, reading and educating ourselves and discussing and wrestling together. And so part of what I'd want to offer is both a nudge in that direction and also an invitation to the ways that we're doing that in our community. So I'll drop my email here and then a link. We run what are called Livable Future Investing workshops, and they're month-long kind of workshops where, again, we try to center the spiritual dimensions of this work in that workshop. David and Ruben have been with us in the workshop space. And, it's really just a community of people to journey with. I think so much of this is about mutual accompaniment and journeying together. And so if it's not this space, there are other spaces where we can create the opportunities to do that with each other. And I think that's really powerful. So thanks. It's been a privilege to be in this space.
I think my parting thoughts are just take a risk. The invitation is out there, and Elizabeth put an invitation out to reach out to her. So same here. I'm open to have conversations about this, and that's where the real risk is, and it's in relationships. And if you want to hear more, and if you want to give more to relationships that could really catapult the work that you're doing, I would just take a risk and reach out and send an email, pick up the phone. When I read Marjorie's book, because when David invited me to this, and I was like, I'm gonna be with Marjorie Kelly. It's like she's gonna think I'm like the wealth supremacist, like I got to read her book. And as soon as I read the book, I read it within like 48 hours. And I reached out to David and I said, I want to talk to Marjorie. I want to be in relationship with her and the institute that she's running. And I just think that the work that you're doing, Stephanie, with Marjorie is inspiring. And it also it brought me a lot of therapy, a lot of healing in my own journey. So I want to thank you publicly for that. And Elizabeth and I have been in community for many years, and we welcome everybody to just take a risk and join us. Just give a call, reach out. That's it, David.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Steph. And I want to thank you, the viewer who's watching me or us. I want to thank the listeners. I want to thank the participants. And I want to remind you that this is just day one of Decolonizing Economics, from Earth Day to May Day. We're on a journey together, and we've still got 2 phenomenal days to come. Tomorrow, we'll have a session on democratizing the economy. We'll have another session on the People's Network for Land and Liberation. We'll have a session on decolonizing restoration and traditional ecological knowledge. We'll have a session on the role of media in decolonizing, and we'll conclude with a session titled Unions as the Mycelial Network of the Environmental Movement. So please stay with us and keep on keeping on. Peace.